Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the Inter-Parliamentary Union, commonly called IPU? What is IPU doing to promote sustainable development and to enhance democracy and many other projects around the world? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're going to take a look at a very unique institution, the Inter-Parliamentary Union, and see what it's doing and its members are doing to combat climate change, to empower women, to promote sustainable development, and deal with many other issues. My guest today is an expert on this institution and on these issues. My guest today is Mr. Saber Chowdhury. Mr. Saber Chowdhury is a member of the Parliament in Bangladesh. Mr. Chowdhury is the president of the Inter-Parliamentary Union. Mr. Chowdhury has, over a period of 18 years of public service, accumulated considerable experience, insights, and understanding of political party organizations, as well as ministerial and parliamentary roles and responsibilities. Your Excellency, Mr. Saber Chowdhury, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Delighted to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. We're going to get into these topics very, very soon and the IPU, but talk a little bit about the Inter-Parliamentary Union. When was it formed? Why was it formed? And what is a parliament? Let's do that.
Parliament, if I start with that, it comes from the
yes.
French word parler, which means to talk. That's the origin of the word. And Parliament is a place where elected representatives of the people get together and they talk about issues that affect the people, about the aspirations of the people, and how you can respond to those. The IPU was in fact founded in 1889, well before the UN and the League of Nations, if I may add. So it was the first real initiative in multilateralism. And if you think back, 1889, 1890s, to think about multilateralism in those times, I think says a lot for the founders of the IPU. It required a lot of courage and vision.
It certainly did, especially at that particular point in history. And of course, as you mentioned, parliaments, Congress, whatever it might be, those are the people's bodies. Those are the ones that deal with the issues.
They are the elected representatives
That's
of
right.
the people, and it varies from country to country. Sometimes you may have a national election every 5 years, every 4 years. And so these are people who are elected by them. And normally parliaments, as with Congress, would enact legislation. You would make laws, you would oversee what governments are doing, scrutiny, make sure that the monies are well spent, and that people get value for money.
Exactly. How many members do you have? How many parliaments participate?
At the moment, we have 166 parliaments, national parliaments, and we have about 45,000 elected representatives within those 166 national parliaments, representing about 6.5 billion people around the world.
Interesting. Now, 166, that pretty much covers a large majority of the democracies or parliaments that exist, does it not?
It does. The exception would be some of the small island states, in the Caribbean, in the South Pacific, they are there. And of course, the US, which would be a notable exception. It was in the IPU for a long time, and then it left the membership in 2003. But the US has, I think, has an abiding interest in the work of the IPU. The State Department is funding many initiatives that we are involved in with regard to empowerment of women. And so USAID is also funding us, but the Congress officially is not present.
I see. Okay. Well, let's talk about, you just wrapped up, or you're about to wrap up, a very important set of meetings at the United Nations this week. What type of conference did you have? What was your theme, and what were some of the major outcomes?
Yes. Parliaments are headed or presided over by what we refer to as speakers. They are the presiding officers. And this is a conference of the speakers. So all of the speakers of the world, even those who don't belong to the IPU, meet once every 5 years here at the UN. And this is a decision of the General Assembly. And they debate, they discuss on many of the global challenges that face the world today. This year is particularly important because it's taken place just before the Sustainable Development Goals Summit, which is going to take place from 25th to 27th September here at the UN. So bringing the voice of the people to that summit is very, very important. And for the first time, the Sustainable Development Goals refer to governance. So there is a very genuine and a very legitimate role for the parliaments to play.
Exactly. And of course, we think back to 2000 when the UN, the member states, the majority of the member states adopted 8 logical, verifiable goals. That
Reportable.
Reportable, that's right, quantifiable, yes. That type of thing, to reduce abject poverty by 50%, empower women, to promote sustainable development, to enhance global partnerships, and 4 others we won't get into. And then now that expires. Those expire basically December 31st,
of
2015.
Yes.
And then sustainable development goals, 17 goals that were built on top of the 8. Talk a little bit about those, not all 17, but a few of them, and the role IPU played in helping to create them.
See, generally there was a discussion when the MDGs were coming to an end, and it started about 2 years ago, whether the number of goals ought to be reduced. So then it would be more manageable. That was the discussion. But then subsequently, because the challenges facing the world are so vast, they decided that no, we will have 17 goals. And they have about 169 targets to measure the goals, and yet to be agreed upon number of indicators. Essentially, the MDGs were just for the developing world, so countries in Asia and Africa. The SDGs are for the entire world, developing and developed. So that's a big difference in terms of aspiration, in terms of scope, in terms of what you're trying to cover. And also the issues are much more broad-based now. You have the whole policy spectrum. So if you're talking about education, you're talking about health, it's all there. So fundamentally, it's a much more ambitious goal. It's a transformative agenda which intends to leave no one behind.
Exactly. And these goals are so very important. Of course, what they want to do is to eliminate poverty. They want to provide food security. They want to promote sustainable development. And we'll talk a little bit about the role of Parliament, because Parliament has to play one of the most critical roles in helping to implement these goals, does it not?
Yes,
or do they not?
It does. If you look at the traditional functions of a Parliament, what do? We enact laws, we provide resources for funding the development, we look at policy oversight, and we represent the people. So all of these are going to be absolutely critical when it comes to implementation of the SDGs, which is why for the first time, and again unlike the MDGs, there is a goal which calls for action on governance. So governance is not a principle that you are trying to aspire to, it's a to-do action. It's something that needs to be done. And parliaments are the bodies that do that.
And will the goals be measured like every 3 years, every 5 years to see how effective the implementation process has been?
Yes, there will be a monitoring mechanism, and parliaments are obviously going to be natural candidates in that regard, because parliaments are the bodies which are mandated by the constitution of the various countries to perform exactly that function.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Inter-Parliamentary Union. You have many goals. You have a lot of activities that are underway, and hopefully we'll get through all of them today. But one area of great interest to you is with youth. That's something that's of great importance to you. Of course, the youth were the leaders of tomorrow, and they have to be well educated. They have to be well informed. They have to be involved. What types of programs do you have? And I'm sure with 166 parliaments, you probably have different programs at each.
Yes, yes.
But what are you doing in general to work with youth?
I think the first thing that we recognize, the IPU, which is absolutely critical, is that the youth are increasingly turning away from politics. They are not engaging with politics. They feel that their voices are not being heard. They feel that what they have to say isn't given the recognition and importance that it deserves. So the first thing that we are trying to do is to get parliaments to engage with young people. It's not just having young members of parliament elected, it's to engage with the youth, it's to talk to them. And when we talk about parliaments, it's not talking just within the parliament, but also reaching out to the people at large. If you look at the demographics of the world, I come from Bangladesh, and 70% of the people are now below the age of 25 or 30. So there is a young population, and as you say, that's the future. If you talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, you talk about climate change. Unless the youth own those agendas, because these are really generational agendas, it's not just for 4 or 5 years, how do you get national ownership? So recognizing the productive dynamism of young people, recognizing that they are the ones who are going to take the country forward in the future. I think this is a must-do engagement, and this is something that the IPU is encouraging all of the parliaments to do.
And do a lot of the parliaments bring in young people to talk with them about youth unemployment, to talk to them,
Yes.
or with them, not to them, but with them about climate change, to talk about what's happening in their country that is a communal problem, really, and they need to focus upon, and to get them involved and maybe to help draft legislation, or certainly to be involved in the discussion leading up to the legislation?
That dialogue is absolutely critical. Engaging with them, getting their views, and then making sure that the legislation that you draft responds to the demands of the youth. I think that is a critical part. But at all stages, engage with them. You can't disengage. And you have to see them leaders not just of tomorrow. They are also the leaders of today. So it's not something that will happen in the future. It's something which is already happening now. And I think realizing that and connecting with the youth is one of the biggest challenges that parliaments around the world have.
It certainly does, and certainly is. And of course, we look at youth unemployment. That is a major problem in
Yes.
a large number of countries. You look at Egypt, probably, and Bangladesh, it's a problem. But I would say the majority of the countries around the world have this problem, and it needs to be dealt with. And hopefully, through their involvement with parliaments and in other venues, they will have a voice in this. You're also involved in promoting democracy. It makes just goes hand in hand. If you're a parliament, you have a democratic process in all probability. People elect members of parliament. What types of projects do you have to promote democracy, and why is democracy so important to just about anybody in any country, wherever you may live?
I think sometimes we get too technical with democracy. It's not an intellectual definition of democracy that you're looking for. So I think at all times what I certainly try and do is to make sure that I give the message that democracy is a mechanism that delivers. Unless democracy delivers, it's never going to be sustainable. People are not going to accept it. You may have the most perfect of elections in the world, but if in between elections you don't meet the aspirations of the people, you don't deliver, then people are not going to believe in democracy. So democracy, on the one hand, yes, it's an end. Yes, you need to have a democratic system because it's possibly the best of the systems that we have. And on the other, it's a means of reaching to other ends. So democracy has a twin function, and we believe that ultimately the strength of a democracy lies in the institution of democracy, and that's parliament. So when you talk of democracy, you have to talk of parliaments, you have to talk of parliamentarians, and you have to talk about meeting people's aspirations.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to the website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com and take a look at some of the previous shows. Also, send us some ideas for future guests and for future topics. My guest today is talking about the Inter-Parliamentary Union and the role that 166 parliaments around the world play in combating climate change and promoting democracy, in empowering women, and in dealing with many other issues. My guest today is an expert on the IPU. My guest today is Mr. Saber Chowdhury. Mr. Saber Chowdhury is a member of the Bangladeshi Parliament, and he is also the president of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, commonly called the IPU. Now, we were talking about the IPU. I might just mention that your website is www.ipu.org, and our viewers can go to that and get much more information
Absolutely.
on what we're talking about. But let's look at another area too, another issue that's a lot of people believe is the number one challenge to everybody on the planet, all living organisms, and that is climate change. We see that the glaciers are melting, the seas are rising, desertification is taking place. This is going to, it is already, it's not going, it's already affecting people. It's happening.
It's a reality today.
That's right. What is the IPU doing? And I know it may vary from country to country, but what are you doing to try to focus the spotlight on climate change and to get the parliaments actively involved in, if not eliminating, we're not going to do that, but perhaps slowing it down or retarding it a bit?
I think our work is at two levels. One is with the national parliaments who are our members, and encouraging them to enact legislation that's going to move their economies towards a renewable economy. I think that is very, very important. The other is because it's a global problem, you must have a global accord. So how can we, through the parliaments, facilitate the process of a global accord? There was a very interesting survey that's been carried out by the London School of Economics. And what they show is that currently 70% of global emissions are covered by some form of legislation or the other. Now, I think that's very interesting, because what that means is that, yes, you need to have a global accord, you need to have a global compact, a global understanding, but you also can have bottom-up action. You can have national parliaments legislating so that the particular countries control their emission of greenhouse gases. And the work of the IPU has been designed at the national parliament level and also trying to have an understanding at the global level. So when the parties meet in Paris for what we refer to as COP, the Conference of Parties meeting in December of this year, the IPU is organizing a meeting of parliamentarians just before the COP meeting kicks in. And what we are trying to do is to push through the parliamentarians their respective national governments to try and reach a deal in Paris. I mean, we are not the executive, we are not replacements or substitutes for the government. But I think what we can do is to encourage that process, is to push this process through the national parliaments that we have. And that's something that we are doing. And as you have said, you interestingly, you referred to glacial melt, you referred to rising sea level, you referred to desertification. And the country that I come from, Bangladesh, is facing all of these problems. If you can visualize or conceptualize a map of South Asia, you've got Nepal and you've got the Himalayas, and then you've got the Bay of Bengal to the bottom. So, Himalayas to the north and Bay of Bengal to the south. And Bangladesh is in between that. And the Himalayas are essentially the water towers for South Asia. 700, 800 million people are dependent on the Himalayas for the fresh water supplies. So glacial melt in the short term is going to result in flooding. But in the long term, it means that your source of fresh water has dried up. And if you can think of the implications, I don't want to think of those implications because it's linked to the very survival of not just Bangladesh, but all of those countries in that region. So you have this effect of glacial melt, and then you've got rising sea levels on the south. And in our case, in the case of Bangladesh, it's going to displace about 30 million people if there's a 1 meter rise in sea level. It's going to inundate about 20% of our land. There will be huge implications in terms of food security because you can't grow the rice, you can't grow the wheat and the maize. So I think it's the biggest national security problem that the world faces. It's not just Bangladesh, because if the boat of Bangladesh goes down, other boats in due course will also go down. So it's really a global priority, and I just hope that we will be able to act before it's too late. I mean, we don't want to have a situation where we have taken action, but that is deemed to be too little too late. We certainly don't want that.
Exactly. And it's frightening to think of 20% of the land of Bangladesh being lost because Bangladesh is one of the most densely populated countries on the planet. And so here, if you lose 20% of your land and you have more population, it is going to create a situation where you'll have refugees, you could have civil unrest. It is a major problem. And many of the defense establishments, I know the U.S. Defense Department has done studies on climate change, and they conclude that that's one of the major challenges in the future. Perhaps far more, not to say I'm not diminishing terrorism or whatever, but still far more important than terrorism because it affects large numbers of people that can actually create a very disruptive situation. So it is a major problem.
And the other aspect would be, you referred to the density of Bangladesh. That density is basically concentrated in the cities. So just imagine if you have 30 million people, and these are the poorest of the poor, and that's based on today's population, have to move to the cities, which are already densely populated. You are going to create an environment for some sort of an explosion. Because the cities simply can't take this many people. And of course, the other related issue would be that of disaster risk reduction. If you look at climate change and the changes in patterns, in the past, again, if I can use the instance of Bangladesh, there are two types of weather patterns. We would talk about high frequency, low impact. So you would have flooding every year, but the impacts would be limited and people would be able to adapt. And then you would have once every 10 years a severe cyclone or a typhoon. So the frequency of that would be less, but the impact would be high. You are actually now moving to a new normal, which is high impact, high frequency. And just as we were having our conference here in New York, we were expecting the speaker from Dominica to join us. And then there was a devastating cyclone that struck that country, and the losses are huge. So these are going to be much more regular. So I think the difference is you are going to have events which are more intense, which create far more destruction than ever before, and these are going to take place more frequently. So climate change and the related issue of risk reduction, I think, go hand in hand.
Exactly, and it's in all of our best interest to deal with this now and not 5, 10 years from now, because we have to deal with it, and if we don't want to, we will in the future. Well, you're also involved in empowering women. That was Millennium Development Goal number 3, and I think it's number 5 on the Sustainable Development Goal list. What are the parliaments, or some of the parliaments doing, or IPU, what you're doing at ipu.org, doing to help empower women?
IPU was, I believe, one of the first organizations that picked up the agenda of women. And I think it was about 30 years ago. And if you look back to what I mentioned earlier about multilateralism and the fact that it was an idea which was well ahead of its time, even for gender, the engagement of IPU has in fact been for 30 years now. What the IPU is doing is through the parliaments, through the legislative process, through policy, through program, ensure that women participate in politics, that women get elected in greater numbers, and that the policies and the legislation that the parliaments enact, in fact, are gender sensitive. That's one of the biggest things that we have done. And of course, it's a cross-cutting issue. So even when you're talking about climate change, you're talking about disasters, you're talking about employment, you're talking about social cohesion, women figure in each of these initiatives. And we have a very active program where we actually reach out to parliaments. Violence against women has been one of our top priorities, and we have helped many countries to enact legislation in that regard. So all of the issues which we are trying to address have a very definitive gender inclusion in them. So I think this has been of great benefit to parliaments and the societies where we have tried to interact, and we will continue to do that. So women are important and youth are important. I think as you look at IPU in the future, what is the IPU going to look like in 25 or 30 years' time? I think these two sections, these two constituencies are going to become increasingly important for us.
They certainly are. And of course, you think of parliaments, you think of laws, as you mentioned earlier, enacting legislation. You're very involved in the whole issue of international law and human rights. How do those two tie into being one of your main goals with IPU?
Well, I think human rights is at the basis of everything that we do. Upholding rights, upholding dignity, allowing people a full enjoyment of those rights. So everything that we do, whether it's a national or international, and there are no borders here. And the international humanitarian law is something which is also developing very fast. And then if you see that in the context of a nuclear weapons-free world, getting rid of nuclear weapons, the international humanitarian law is also coming into play there. I mean, law has a fundamental function in any society, but I think the law which is most important is that of human rights. And we try and not just practice it, we try and promote it, and we try and protect it. Within the IPU, we also have a very interesting committee, and this is a committee which has to do with human rights of parliamentarians. So individuals who promote the human rights of other people must also have their own rights protected if they are to stand up for those people. I think this is a unique committee. I don't believe such a committee exists anywhere else. And we have this within the IPU. And every year during our assemblies, we actually monitor cases where human rights violations are being carried out, and the target are elected representatives. Because unless you can protect the defenders of human rights, protecting the human rights of the ordinary citizen is going to be that much more challenging.
And in the last 30 seconds we have, what do you think is the major challenge that IPU will be dealing with, the United Nations agencies and the world in general? We've talked about climate change, but is there something else that you think we're going to be encountering as we move further into the 21st century?
Making the IPU fit for purpose. I know that fit for purpose is something that's discussed here a lot in New York, and also with regard to the UN, as you have had 70 years. And I think all organizations have to go through this process of renewal, self-assessment to see where they are. The needs of parliaments are very different today compared to what they were when the IPU was founded. And especially now that we are talking about this very ambitious post-2015 development agenda, where you've got climate change, sustainable development, disaster risk reduction. The capacity demand on parliaments are going to be huge. So parliaments have to be upgraded, parliaments have to be fit for purpose, and the IPU, being the World Organization of Parliaments, also has to be fit for purpose.
Exactly. Well, Mr. Saber Chowdhury, member of the Bangladeshi Parliament and president of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, these are very important issues. We need to learn much more about them, and we need to be involved hands-on in helping to reverse some of these negative trends. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you. Delighted I could share some thoughts with you.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.